Welcome back to the Village Wealth How to Buy a Business Masterclass. This is episode number 4, and we're talking about financing your acquisition. Super high level, businesses are financed through debt and equity. So you have your debt side of the equation, you have your equity. Equity is brought to the table with shareholders. You will become a shareholder when you acquire the company. That's like funds that you bring to the deal. Debt is lenders, financial institutions, and debt, can break up into whole different varieties of debt. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to keep it pretty high level and just talk about the two, right? So let's talk about what the elephant in the room is. Let's buy a business with putting zero money down. Don't come to the table thinking that you're going to buy a business with zero money down. Sure, you can maybe use zero of your money, but you better come to the table with somebody else's money that's funded you and have some cash to put into the transaction, because the banks are never going to lend you anything unless you have some skin in the game, unless you're putting some of your own money. Sure, it doesn't have to be your own money, it can come from somebody else, but it needs to be channeled through you to the bank so that you're putting in your 20-30% of the purchase. And that's really kind of, let's talk about the debts, the stack here. That's how it's going to start at the bottom, right? You're going to have your 20 to 30% of the purchase funds are going to be coming from you or someone who's lent you that money, right? Okay, so that's the equity that you're going to put into the deal. Now, the rest of it can be financed in different ways, right? A lot of it is normally financed through debt. That is a lending institution, you were borrowing the money off of them, and they're kind of filling the tank. The remainder, like call it up to 80%, the rest of the 80% is gonna be filled up by a lender, right? And this is the hard part. You can go out and you can make an offer on a business, and the business, I'm gonna buy this for $2 million, and that's what you've signed the letter of intent at. Well, when the bank looks at it and the bank determines the business is only worth $1 million and they're only going to lend 70% of that, well, now you only have $700,000 that's coming from the bank. So you have to be realistic about expectations from a lending perspective, because that, I always say when I'm selling a business, I'm selling two people. I'm selling the buyer and I'm selling the bank. So you need to be inside what I call the box reality. It's actually from Len Crick, but inside the box reality on what this company's worth. Otherwise, if you're out to lunch, the bank's not going to lend on it anyway. So that aside, you've put your 30% in, and now the bank's kind of topped you up, and they've put their 60, and that's bringing you up to 90% of the agreed upon purchase price between the seller and the buyer. So you've got this gap, right? You've got this kind of evil gap that needs to be filled of 10% before you can get this deal across the finish line. That's going to likely, in most transactions, get filled with a vendor note. And it's called a seller note as well. And this is where the seller, they actually lend you, in quotations, because there's no physical money transferred, but they lend you the money to fill that gap, to bring it up, bring the purchase price up to like what you guys agreed upon. And then you'll pay that over time. And it's no different than any other note, right? There's going to be a percentage attached to it, 5, 6, 7, 10% interest. There's going to be a term amount of time attached to it. So you're going to be paying that over 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. This is where the rubber hits the road in reality. As sellers start to get cagey around that 20%. You can usually stretch a seller up to 20% vendor note. Beyond that, it becomes a little bit more difficult. If this is a business that's super high risk and no lending institution wants to lend on it, no external independent parties want to finance it, then the seller probably knows that, and they may be more open to extending the vendor note and doing a vendor note up to, even 100% if this is a super high risk business and no one else wants to acquire it. But for the most part, if you're dealing with a quality business that has consistent cash returns, the seller's not really going to want to lend you any more than 20%. So just factor that in. The other one, and it's kind of the last tool in your tool belt, when you're acquiring a business from a financing structure perspective, is the earnout. And sellers hate earnouts. And let me tell you what an earnout is. So an earnout is when you say, let's use our round numbers because they're really easy. It's like you make an offer on the business, it's $1 million. The seller thinks the business is worth $1.5 million. That's a pretty big gap, right? The bank will only lend, call it, the bank and your equity that you put in brings you to $1 million. So your gap's $500,000. This is a pretty big gap. You can fill some of that gap with the vendor note. So let's say you fill $300,000 with the vendor note. Now you're still off by $200,000. So the question is, like, what tools are at our disposal to fill this $200,000? That's where you could bring an earnout in, because your valuation of the business at $1 million and the seller's valuation of the business at $1.5 million. The main reason why that gap exists is because the seller is thinking it's going to do better in the future. You're thinking it's likely going to do the same or worse in the future. Maybe in the first year when you're learning out how to figure out the business. So that's what creates this value gap, right? So the earnout is a tool that you can say, all right, I will pay you the extra $200,000 if the business does X amount of revenue or X amount of earnings, right? So you can tie it to hitting a certain amount of EBITDA, or you can tie it to hitting a certain amount of revenue. And if it does that, it triggers the earnout and they get paid their extra amount of money. So you can tell why this would be good from a buy side for you. You would be thinking, yeah, sweet. So if the business doesn't do that great, then I don't pay the money. If it does great, I'll have the money because the business will have it in retained earnings, and I can just pay it out of the business. Perfect. That works very well in the scenario where the business does great or the business doesn't do well. You're covered from a buy side. The seller, they don't like it because their number one thing is they want all cash at close. So you got to remember, that's where they start. They want all cash at close. They don't want a vendor note. They don't want an earnout. They want it all at close. And they'll have a difficult time swallowing this. But it does end up being put into a lot of transactions because it bridges that gap between what a seller's thinking from an expected valuation point and what you're thinking from probably a realistic valuation point. So those are your tools, right? You've got the equity that you're putting into the deal as a shareholder, or if you're going with a couple people buying the company and multiple shareholders. You've got the debt that's coming from the bank, a financial institution. You've also got a seller note or a vendor note that can come from a seller, or you have an earnout to kind of bridge that, really stretch and bridge that gap between seller's expectation and what you want to pay for the company. That's financing a deal in Village Wealth Masterclass. See you in the next episode number 5.